Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are on the Imaarah. The next chapter about it being forbidden for a muhajir to return to his place which he left for the sake of Allah, for the purpose of settling there. From Salama ibn al-Aqwa, he visited al-Hajjaj, who said to him, O son of al-Aqwa, have you returned back on your heels? You have come to live in the desert again? Salama said, no, but the Prophet allowed me to live in the desert. Al-Hajjaj is asking, have you returned back to the place you made hijrah from? And that will be the countryside, outside the cities. And this is because there is a consensus that you're not allowed to return to a place you have made hijrah from. Because when you leave something for the sake of Allah, you're not allowed to take it back. Whether it be making hijrah, so you leave a place, whether it be giving charity, so you leave some of your wealth. When you leave something, you cannot take it back. That is the general rule. As for Salama ibn Aqwa, he says that the Prophet permitted him to live in the countryside. Why this permission was given to him is unclear, but the general rule is you do not return back to the place you made hijrah from to live therein. Of course, you can return to it for, let's say, medical treatment or some other need, perhaps the business dealings and so on, but not to stay and to live and to reside permanently. We can also take the rude manner in which Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf addressed the noble companion Salama, and how Salama ibn al-Aqwa radiallahu anh showed patience. And this is how we should act in front of the ignoramuses. The next chapter about no hijrah after the conquest of Mecca, but jihad still remains. From Aisha, the Prophet said, لا هجرة بعد الفتح ولكن جهاد ونية وإذا استنفرتم فانفروا. There is no hijrah, emigration, after the Mecca conquest, but jihad and sincere intention do remain, and when you are asked to set forth and march for fighting, then you should set out. So that is to say that after the conquest of Mecca, you do not need to make hijrah from Mecca to Al-Madinah because Mecca is a Muslim place now. And hijrah is only ever obligatory if you are unable to openly express your Islam in that particular place. So you can leave Mecca and go to Medina for the purpose of jihad, but not for the purpose of hijrah. Jihad becomes a fardu ayn upon you if the Imam specifically points to you to march out with him. Secondly, if you are in the ranks and the enemies meet you, so you're not allowed to flee, so it becomes binding upon you, fardu ayn. Thirdly, if the enemy invades your country or your land, then it becomes binding upon you as well. And fourthly, if you have particular expertise that no one else has, and so you are indispensable, so it becomes binding upon you. These are 4 conditions on which jihad becomes fardu ayn upon you. Otherwise it is fardu kifaya. As Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَمَا كَانَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ لِيَنْفِرُوا كَافَّةً. It is not for the believers to all march out together. Rather, a party of you should stay behind to learn their deen so that they could teach the others when they return. So learning knowledge is a type of jihad as well. Note here that this hadith cannot be used as an evidence that hijrah is no longer applicable in this day and age. No, because the Prophet in the Sunan authentically said, لا تنقطع الهجرة حتى تنقطع التوبة ولا تنقطع التوبة حتى تخرج الشمس من مغربها. Hijrah would not cease to exist until tawbah ceased to exist, repentance. And repentance will not cease to exist until the sun rises from its west. So hijrah will exist up till very close to Yawm al-Qiyamah. As for this hadith, it is specifically speaking about the hijrah from Mecca to Al-Madinah, because this is what the context indicates to us. Because Mecca is a Muslim place now, there's no need to make hijrah from Mecca to Al-Madinah. So you do not need to make hijrah from a Muslim place. You do, however, need to make hijrah from a kafir place, or generally from a place which does not allow you to exhibit your deen of al-Islam openly. Another hadith in the same chapter, from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, he says, a man from the Bedouin came to ask the Prophet about hijrah. And the Prophet said, وَيْحَكْ إِنَّ شَأْنَ الْهِجْرَةِ لَشَدِيدٌ. What do you have to do with hijrah? The matter of hijrah is very difficult. فَهَلْ لَكَ مِنْ إِبِلٍ. Do you have camels? He said, yes. The Prophet asked, فَهَلْ تُؤْتِي صَدَقَتَهَا. Do you pay charity from it, meaning the zakah? He said, yes. The Prophet said, فَعْمَلْ مِنْ وَرَاءِ الْبِحَارِ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَنْ يَتِرَكَ مِنْ عَمَلِكَ شَيْئًا. then keep working from your village, for Allah will not leave any of your good deeds unrewarded. So this Arabi is asking about the hijrah. The Prophet knew that for this man, hijrah is going to be very difficult. For this man to leave his camels and to leave his land to migrate to Al-Madinah is not going to be easy for his circumstances. And this hadith would be therefore parallel to the hadith also in the Sahih, where a man asked about jihad and the Prophet said, Ahayyun walidak, are your parents alive? He said, yes, and the Prophet answered, فَفِيهِمَا فَجَاهِدْ, so strive in their cause. So the Prophet did not tell him to fight for the sake of Allah here, because his circumstances were different. So every person is to be treated on their own merits. And then a person who cannot perform the hijrah and cannot remain patient away from his family and away from the lifestyle that he's used to, may well just return back to the place he made hijrah from. And this is an abuse of hijrah. And the Prophet tells him that you do not have to make hijrah to perform righteous deeds. Rather, righteous deeds can be performed anywhere. And Allah Jalla wa Ala will not waste your righteous deeds. So these ahadith do not mean that hijrah is not wajib for the one who fulfills the conditions, or that jihad is not wajib for the ones who fulfill the conditions. However, each person needs to be treated on their own merits. And so certainly we can give a general rule, but it does not mean that the general rule will apply to every single individual person. Rather, each individual person needs to be looked at on his own merits. The next chapter about how the bay'ah or the pledge is given by the women. From Aisha, she says, when the mu'minat would migrate to Al-Madinah, the Prophet would test their iman according to how Allah Jalla wa Ala orders him. Whoever from the women agreed to the conditions of the pledge, they were given the official pledge, and the Prophet would then tell them, انطلقنا فقد بايعتكن, you may go, for I have accepted your pledge of allegiance. She says, by Allah, the Prophet never took any contract with any woman except that which Allah ordered him, and his palm never touched the palm of any other woman. When he had taken their pledge, he would tell them that he had taken their pledge orally. So we find here that the Prophet would not shake the hands of women when giving the pledge of allegiance, whereas he would shake the hands of men. Bay'ah comes from the word ba', which means your whole arm length, and this is because when you're giving the bay'ah, you stretch out your hand to shake, and that is what the ba' is. It is your whole arm length. The Prophet, the purest of men, would never touch women. So how about for us? Aisha says, ما مست كف رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كف امرأة قط. The palm of the Prophet never touched the palm of another woman. Of course, she is talking about a non-mahram woman. And it makes no difference whether the woman is old or young. And it makes no difference whether you shake the hands of a woman with a barrier or no barrier. So whether she's wearing gloves or any other cloth or anything of that sort. All of this shaking hands is impermissible because it is all a fitna. And if a woman offers you her hand, or a man offers a Muslim woman his hand to shake, then you must refuse politely and give them the reason why you are refusing. Never just refuse and keep quiet, because this will create confusion in the mind of the other person. So you must explain to the other person that you are honor bound not to shake the hands of a member of the opposite gender who is not closely related to you. One might say here, but the mere actions of the Prophet do not denote obligation or prohibition. Just because the Prophet is not shaking hands does not mean it is haram. Well, we say, okay, we understand this argument. However, because it was normal practice for people to shake hands when giving and taking pledges of allegiance, this ought to be done. And because the Prophet did not do it and went against the customary practices, would have to denote to us that it is haram. Otherwise, why would the Prophet go against the customary practices? This was not his habitual practice to go against that which is customary. He, for example, wore the izar and the rida. That was a customary practice. On top of that, we have far more explicit narrations, verbal commands from the Prophet not to shake hands of the women. Note that there is a narration which says that the Prophet would shake hands with women from under a cloth, and it must be noted that this hadith is weak and cannot be relied upon. As far as a verbal command is concerned, the Prophet ﷺ authentically, in the collection of At-Tabarani, said that for one of you to be banged on the back of the head with an iron needle is better than to shake hands with a non-mahram woman. So that's a clear-cut evidence. The next chapter, about the pledge of allegiance, of listening and obeying the ruler as much as you are able to do so. From Abdullah ibn Umar, he said, we used to take the oath of allegiance to the messenger, that we would listen to him and obey his orders, and the Prophet would tell us, as much as I am able to. Meaning you say, I would listen and obey as much as I am able to do so. Because when it comes to commands, then if you are able to do them or not plays a role. So you have to fulfill it as much as you are able to fulfill it. And Allah does not burden a soul more than it can bear. Let us move to the next chapter, about the age of maturity. From Ibn Umar, who says that the Prophet inspected me for the battlefield, for the battle of Uhud, and I was 14 years old. He did not allow me to fight. Then in the battle of Khandaq, I was 15 years old and he permitted me to fight. Nafi' says that I came to Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who was the Khalifa at that time, and narrated this tradition to him, and he says that this hadith demarcates the age of maturity. So he wrote to one of his governors, saying that they should pay subsistence allowance to the one who was 15 years old, and those who were less than that should be treated as children. This hadith would tend to suggest that the age of maturity is 15. Some other scholars have said it is 18. Others have said that when it comes to money matters, it is 18, and when it comes to the ibadah matters, it is 15. But the correct opinion is that it makes no difference whether it is a financial matter or a worship matter. At 15 you are of age. But really, the age of maturity happens when either he sees pubic hair, or he has a wet dream, or he reaches the age of 15, or if a female menstruates. Whichever one of these happens first, then that is the age of maturity. The next chapter, that it is forbidden to take the Quran to the land of the kuffar, where you fear it will fall into the wrong hands. From Ibn Umar, who says that the Prophet forbade to take the Quran to the land of the enemies. The mafasid, or the corruption of taking the Quran to the land of the enemies, is that first of all they may desecrate the mushaf, so treat it with disrespect. Secondly, they may follow those ayat which are mutashabihat and use it to cast doubts and shubuhat into the minds of the Muslims, and then argue that the Quran contradicts itself. Or, thirdly, they may use some ayat of the Quran to argue against the Muslims that they should not fight the kuffar. For example, where the Quran says, وَلَتَجِدَنَّ أَقْرَبَهُمْ مَوَدَّةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّا نَصَارَى. The closest to the Muslims in love are those who say, we are Christians. Likewise, لَا يَنْهَاكُمُ اللَّهُ عَنِ الَّذِينَ لَمْ يُقَاتِلُوكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ وَلَمْ يُخْرِجُوكُمْ مِنْ دِيَارِكُمْ أَنْ تَبَرُّوهُمْ وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. Allah does not forbid you from treating those who did not fight you on account of deen, nor drove you out of your homes, to be just to them and treat them well. And so this is why Ayyub, in one of the narrations, says that the kuffar will take it and use it to argue against you. However, does this hadith apply today? Well, the answer is no, because whether you take the Quran to the land of the enemy or not, they can easily get a hold of the Quran. It is widely available everywhere in the world, and you can obtain electronic copies and physical copies. But a more pertinent question will be, can you give the mushaf to a kafir? Well, if we say that you have to be in a state of wudu to touch the mushaf, then no, you cannot give the Arabic mushaf to the kafir, but there is no problem in giving the translation. We can also take that what is written in the mushaf is the Quran, because the Prophet forbade that we should travel with the Quran to the land of the enemies. This is how the narration translates to. So traveling with the Quran would have to mean with the mushaf. So therefore the Quran is written in the mushaf. The next chapter, about horse racing. Ibn Umar narrates that the Prophet raced horses which were prepared for racing, so they were slim ones, between a place called Hafya and Thaniyatul Wada'. The distance is about 6 miles. And as for those horses which have not been trained, he raced them from Thaniya to the masjid of Bani Zurayq, and that is about 1 mile. And Ibn Umar was amongst those who took part in the race. We take that horse racing is fine because it prepares you for jihad. In fact, any activity which prepares you for jihad is to be encouraged. Nowadays, not many people fight on horses, but you would have fighter jets and tanks and so on. And in these types of competitions, gambling is allowed. And this is a glaring exception to the general rule. Why is gambling allowed in this particular case? Because with gambling you're going to encourage people to take part in these races, and this will produce the advantage of preparing people for jihad. That advantage is superior to the mafsada, or to the corruption of the actual gambling itself. So in this particular case then, even gambling is permitted, because of the general rule, when the maslaha is more than the mafsada, the action is permitted. If it's the other way around, the action is not permitted, it is haram, and if it is even, then the action is haram. Similarly, racing camels is also allowed because they also used to be used for jihad, for carrying the luggage of the mujahideen. And also archery. Gambling is allowed in archery competitions. And when we say gambling, we mean, let's say there are 5 people taking part in a competition. Each person will put some money in the pot and the winner takes all. We are not talking about placing bets as to who will win the competition. So these competitions are related to jihad. But nowadays people do not fight on horses, and they do not use camels and archery. So these activities no longer are related to jihad. But those activities which are related to jihad will take the same ruling, such as racing fighter jets, or firing machine guns and assault rifles, and so on. And it is not a condition that there should be a muhallil, somebody who enters the race who does not put anything to the pot. There is a hadith to this effect which is da'if. Rather, we simply say gambling is permitted in this particular scenario. Why? Because of what we mentioned. The maslaha outweighs the mafsada. The next chapter about the goodness tied to the forelocks of the horses. From Jarir ibn Abdullah that the Prophet said, Al-khaylu ma'qudun binawasiha al-khayru ila yawm al-qiyamah al-ajru wal-ghanima. Goodness is tied to the forelocks of horses up till yawm al-qiyamah, the reward and the war booty. So the goodness is tied because horses are used for war. Of course, nowadays horses are not really used for war. But if people were to use horses, then the hadith still stands. Could it be that the hadith is indicating that warfare will return back to horses, so that people will fight using horses, as opposed to nowadays fighting using fighter jets? Well, not really. The hadith does not necessarily indicate this. All the hadith is saying is that as long as horses are being used for warfare, then there is goodness attached to them. The next chapter about what is disliked from the characteristics of horses. Abu Huraira reports that the Prophet would dislike the shikal from the horses. And what does this word shikal mean? Another narration tells us that it is when the back left foot and the front right foot of the horse are both white. Or the other way around, the back right foot and the front left foot are both white. Now this karaha, the idea of disliking something, is not a shar'i ruling, rather it is the Prophet's personal taste. For example, the sand lizard. The Prophet would not like to eat it because he was not used to it. He said, it's not from the food of my land, so I find myself feeling averse to it. That does not mean that the sand lizard is haram to eat. The companions ate it. People can have different taste in horses. A white blaze on the forehead of the horse is seen to be beautiful. All 4 feet being white are seen to be beautiful. So people have their personal tastes. The next chapter, the virtue of fighting for the sake of Allah. From Abu Huraira, the Prophet said, تَكَفَّلَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ جَاهَدَ فِي سَبِيلِهِ لَا يُخْرِجُهُ مِنْ بَيْتِهِ إِلَّا جِهَادٌ فِي سَبِيلِهِ وَتَصْدِيقُ كَلِمَتِهِ بِأَنْ يُدْخِلَهُ الْجَنَّةَ أَوْ يَرْجِعَهُ إِلَى مَسْكَنِهِ الَّذِي خَرَجَ مِنْهُ مَعَ مَا نَالَ مِنْ أَجْرٍ أَوْ غَنِيمَةٍ. Allah guarantees for the one who fights in His cause. The only thing which makes him leave his house is fighting for the cause of Allah and firm belief in His words. Allah guarantees for such a person that He will enter him into Jannah, or return him back to his home with reward or war booty. The Prophet also said, وَالَّذِي نَفْسُ مُحَمَّدٍ بِيَدِهِ لَوَدِدْتُ أَنِّي أَغْزُو فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَأُقْتَلْ ثُمَّ أَغْزُو فَأُقْتَلْ ثُمَّ أَغْزُو فَأُقْتَلْ. I would love to fight in the way of Allah and then be killed, and then fight again and then be killed, and then fight again and then be killed. So we find the virtue of fighting in the way of Allah. However, there are conditions for you to attain this virtue. It must be to raise the word of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And people can be of different types here. Somebody may fight because he's had enough of life and he doesn't care if he dies. So he may as well just go out to fight, and if he dies, that's good enough because he's had enough of life. This is not fighting in the way of Allah. Rather, this is a sinful intention because it is closer to suicide. Secondly, we can have somebody who goes out to fight just for ghanima. Such a person is not fighting for the sake of Allah, and he has no reward for the fighting. But you could argue that he is not sinful, because ghanima is halal, and therefore you can make your intention for it. But do not expect reward for the actual fighting itself. It's a similar case where the Prophet said, فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى الدُّنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا أَوْ امْرَأَةٍ يَتَزَوَّجُهَا فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. Whoever makes hijrah to gain some wealth of the world, so for economic needs, or for a woman to marry, then his hijrah is for that, for which he makes his intention. So that is to say, he did not make his intention for the noble cause of his hijrah to be for Allah and the Messenger. And we could say the same thing for jihad as well, if you just make jihad for the war booty alone. We cannot say you're sinful, but then again, you're not reward worthy either. Thirdly, you can have somebody who goes out to fight with the intention of becoming a shaheed. We say to him, you're wasting your time. You will not be a shaheed if you die in such a battle, because your intention is not correct. So he will not gain the shahada. However, he is still reward worthy for wanting to fight. And then fourthly, we have the one who fights for the purpose of raising the word of Allah Jalla wa Ala above the word of kufr. And this is in the way of Allah. And he fights out of his iman in Allah Jalla wa Ala and his belief in the Prophet. Such a person, if he dies, is a shaheed. And if he is not a shaheed, he is reward worthy, the reward of jihad. Having said that, we do not testify Jannah or Shahada for such a person. That is, personally for him. Though we would treat him as a shaheed. But we do not know. Maybe there are preventative factors that Allah knows about which prevents him from being a shaheed in the hereafter. But as far as we are concerned, we will treat him as a shaheed, but refrain from declaring him as a shaheed. So note this difference. Al-Imam al-Bukhari has a title in his Sahih saying that Fulan, a person, should not be said that he is shaheed. And he uses as evidence, مَا مِن مَكْلُومٍ يُكْلَمُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ يُكْلَمُ فِي سَبِيلِهِ إِلَّا جَاءَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ وَجُرْحُهُ يَثْعُبُ دَمًا اللَّوْنُ لَوْمُ الدَّمِ وَالرِّيحُ رِيحُ الْمِسْكِ. There is no one injured in the way of Allah, and Allah knows best who is injured in His cause, except such a person will come on Yawm al-Qiyamah, his wound would be flowing with blood, the color would be the color of blood, but the smell will be the scent of misk, which is a type of perfume. So the point is, Allah knows best who is injured in His cause. That means we do not know best, and hence we refrain from saying that Fulan is a shaheed. So we give a warning to those who just want to fight because they've had enough of life and they don't mind dying, or for those who just want the ghanima, or to those who just want the shahada, they want to die as a shaheed. We say to them, no, rectify your niyyah. The fourth niyyah is the correct one, so that the word of Allah Jalla wa Ala may become the highest. A mujahid may attain ghanima and ajr, but sometimes in his fight he may not attain any ghanima, like what happened with the Battle of Tabuk, because there was no battle that took place, but he will return with ajr. Somebody may return with the ghanima but no ajr, and this is if he fights with the intention of just gaining the ghanima, and he doesn't care if the word of Allah is the highest or not. If they win the fight, he certainly has his share of the ghanima, but no ajr. Also in the chapter, the hadith which we did previously quote from Al-Bukhari, but it's also in Muslim, from Abu Hurairah, لا يكلم أحد في سبيل الله والله أعلم بمن يكلم في سبيله إلا جاء يوم القيامة وجرحه يثعب اللون لون الدم والريح ريح مسك. So this particular hadith, like we said before, can be used as evidence to say that you're not allowed to declare anyone to be a shaheed, even if you treat him as one in this life, because we do not know in the hereafter. There may be some preventative factor which prevents him from being a shaheed. Also in the chapter from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet said, لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأحببت ألا أتخلف خلف السرية. If it was not going to produce difficulty upon my nation, I would love not to lag behind any military detachment. So we find from this narration the Prophet is leaving off a righteous action because it can have detrimental effects. Now what this means is that if the Prophet were to leave to go out fighting, then everyone else in Al-Madinah would want to be with the Prophet, as how could the Sahaba keep themselves safe in Al-Madinah when the Prophet is marching out to fight? So if every time the Prophet went out to fight, it means that all his companions would want to go out with him, or at least feel compelled to do so, and this would cause great difficulty on many companions. So oftentimes the Prophet would send out a sariyah whilst keeping himself behind, so that the other companions would not feel guilty in remaining behind as well. Also, a sariyah is so called from the word sara yasri, which means to go out and spread through, because a whole army is going to attract too much attention. So a small detachment is easier to send out because it is more low-key. Let's take a look at the next chapter about the fadila, or the virtue of being a shaheed. From Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet said, مَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ يَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةَ يُحِبُّ أَنْ يَرْجِعَ إِلَى الدُّنْيَا وَأَنَّ لَهُ مَا عَلَى الْأَرْضِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ غَيْرُ الشَّهِيدِ فإنه يتمنى أن يرجع فيقتل 10 مرات لما يرى من الكرامة. There is no one who enters Jannah who would want to return back to the world and have anything on the earth except the shaheed. He would wish that he can return so he can be killed 10 times due to what he sees of the honor which he receives. From this hadith, it is difficult to imagine what type of honor the shaheed must receive for him to return and leave Jannah. How on earth could somebody want to leave Jannah? Where Allah tells us, لا يبغون عنها حولا. They would not want to be removed from Jannah. Yet, we find this glaring exception for the shaheed. No one who enjoys Jannah would ever want to come back, except for the shaheed. But because of this honor which he receives, he wants to have it again and again. It is difficult to imagine, but all that can be said is that this hadith informs us of an immensely, unimaginably powerful fadila or virtue for the shuhada. Also from the fadila of the jihad, from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet was asked, مَا يَعْدِلُ الْجِهَادَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. What is equivalent to jihad fi sabilillah? The Prophet said, لَا تَسْتَطِيعُوهُ. You will not be able to do it. But the questioner asked the question repeatedly, and every time the Prophet would say, you would not be able to do it. And the third time the Prophet said, مَثَلُ الْمُجَاهِدِ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلِ الصَّائِمِ الْقَائِمِ الْقَانِتِ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ لَا يَفْتُرُ مِنْ صِيَامٍ وَلَا صَلَاةٍ حَتَّى يَرْجِعَ الْمُجَاهِدُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. The parable of the mujahid in the way of Allah is like the parable of the one who is constantly fasting and standing in prayer and continuously reciting the ayat of Allah and does not exhibit any lassitude, that is, does not tire in his fasting and prayer until the mujahid in the way of Allah Ta'ala returns back. So this hadith really speaks for itself, and it gives us information about the fadila or the virtue of jihad. But really nothing is equivalent to it, because who is able to be constantly in fasting and prayer without any lassitude until the mujahid returns? This could be days, it could even be weeks, it could be months. The parable given there is with the salah and the siyam. Both of these actions only benefit you, whereas jihad benefits not just you, but nations, generation after generation. Also in the chapter from Nu'man ibn Bashir, he said, I was sitting next to the mimbar of the Prophet, and a man said, I do not care, after embracing Islam, that I do not do any good deed except distributing water to the Hujjaj. Another one said, I do not care, after embracing Islam, that I should do any good deed except keeping myself in the Al-Masjid al-Haram. A third man said, Al-Jihadu fi sabilillahi afdalu mimma qultum. Fighting in the way of Allah is better than all what you have said. Then Umar radiallahu anh came and rebuked them. He said, do not raise your voices at the mimbar of the Prophet, and it is also Yawm al-Jumu'ah. But rather, when I have prayed the Jumu'ah, I will enter upon the Prophet and ask him about what you are differing. And to this incident, Allah Jalla wa Ala revealed the ayah in Surah At-Tawbah, أَجَعَلْتُمْ سِقَايَةَ الْحَاجِّ وَإِعْمَارَةَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ كَمَنْ آمَنَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ, up until the end of the ayah. Do you consider giving drink to the pilgrims and populating Al-Masjid al-Haram to be equal to the one who has Iman in Allah in the last day and fights in the way of Allah? Not equal are they with Allah, and Allah does not guide the Zalimun. We take from this noble narration that you do not raise your voice in the masajid, neither on Yawm al-Jumu'ah nor any other day. The masajid must be respected and voices must not be raised, except for the one giving the khutbah of the Jumu'ah, in which case it is legislated to raise the voice in a desperate type of fashion, in a passionate way. And we also take again the fadila of jihad. There is no action that is better than it for the one on whom jihad is obligatory or even recommended. It is the only action in which you have to put your life on the line, and some ulama even consider it as a sixth pillar of Islam. The next chapter about leaving for the jihad in the morning and evening. From Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet said, لا غدوة في سبيل الله أو روحة خير من الدنيا وما فيها. Leaving to fight in the way of Allah in the morning or in the afternoon is better than the whole world and whatever is in it. The ghadwa is the first part of the daylight hours, and the rawha is the latter part of the daylight hours. And it makes no difference whether there is actually fighting which takes place. For example, in the Battle of Tabuk, there was no fight which took place. So would such a person merit the same reward as spoken of in this hadith, even if there was no fighting taking place? The answer is yes, because at least he did have his intention, and that is what matters. What about going out in the morning or evening to seek the knowledge of the Sharia? Is that action included in this hadith? Well, the answer is no. However, it is still a virtuous action to go out seeking knowledge, because there are not too many actions better than seeking knowledge, if your intention is correct. That is, to remove ignorance from your own self and from others when you teach them knowledge. So which is better, seeking knowledge or fighting? We say it depends on the person. If a person is better at learning, then seeking knowledge is the one for him. If he is strong and powerful and brave, and he's better at fighting, then that is for him, because people are unique. That's how Allah Jalla wa Ala has created them, with differing abilities and talents. The next chapter, the lofty status reserved for the mujahid. From Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, the Prophet said to him, Ya Aba Sa'id, man radiya billahi rabban, wa bil islami dinan, wa bi Muhammadin nabiyyan, wajabat lahu al-jannah. O Abu Sa'id, whoever is content with Allah as his Rabb, and Islam as his deen, and Muhammad as his Prophet, Jannah becomes wajib upon him. And these words pleased Abu Sa'id, and he said, A'idha alayya ya Rasulullah, repeat them for me, O Messenger of Allah. And the Prophet did so. But then thereafter the Prophet said, وَأُخْرَى يُرْفَعُ بِهَا الْعَبْدُ مِئَةَ دَرَجَةٍ فِي الْجَنَّةِ مَا بَيْنَ كُلِّ دَرَجَتَيْنِ كَمَا بَيْنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ. But there is another action by which a servant will be raised 100 grades in Jannah. Between every 2 grades is like the distance between the heaven and the earth. He asked, مَا هِيَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ, what is it, O Messenger of Allah? And the Prophet replied, الْجِهَادُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الْجِهَادُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Being pleased with Allah as your Rabb means being content to worship Him, but also being content with His ahkam, be it ahkam shar'iyya or ahkam kawniyya. So for example, His hukum shar'i is that you will pray 5 times a day. You must be content with this rule. Or for example, a hukum kawni is, let's say, you suffer some financial loss or some loss in your health, some other bitter fortune. This is from the qadr of Allah Jalla wa Ala, and you must be content with the hukum of Allah. Even if its effects may be bitter and you are not content with, but the hukum of Allah as His action, you must be content. That Allah knows what He is doing and He does it for a wisdom. So his response to the hukum shar'i is sami'na wa ata'na, and his response to the hukum kawni, if it is bitter, is inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And if it is sweet, it is alhamdulillah. What does deen mean? It means kullu ma yultazamu bihi, everything which one adheres to. And Islam must be the deen which you are content with, nothing else. And so we give upon this hadith a warning to the Ahlul Bid'ah who introduce new affairs. If you introduce new affairs and Bid'ah in the deen, it means you are not content with Islam as your deen. And hence the promise of Jannah is somewhat tentative. What about being content with Muhammad as the Prophet? We say to those who believe that there are other prophets or other prophets after the last prophet, that again, you have not tasted the sweetness of Iman, and the promise of Jannah does not apply to you in aught. And likewise, being content with Allah as your Rabb, those who do not believe in Allah or those who worship others besides Allah, again, there is no promise for them for Jannah. In fact, there is a promise for them for Jahannam. What about those who say that the rules and ahkam of Islam are outdated and they should be modified to suit the needs of the modern man? We say you have not been content with Islam as your deen, and hence you have no promise of Jannah. Now, we have seen from the preceding ahadith that it appears to us that al-jihad fi sabilillah is the best of actions. We also know from the authentic narration that the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah are the best days for righteous actions, even better than jihad fi sabilillah, as the Prophet was asked about. And so this would be an exception to the general case that al-jihad is the best of actions. Okay, let's take some review questions at this stage. So question number 1. We mentioned 4 intentions of the mujahid. Recall those intentions along with their respective ruling. Question number 2. We said that fighting in the way of Allah is fardu kifaya, however it can become fardu ayn on some occasions. Recall those occasions. There are 4 occasions in total. Question number 3. Why did the Prophet not always go out fighting and rather sent saraya or army detachments to go out?